Harvard Divinity School.
Magic in the United States, April 10th, 2024.
My name is Giovanna Parmigiani, and I'm the host of this series organized within the Transcendence and Transformation Initiative here at the CSWR at Harvard Divinity School. This series focuses on ways of knowing that are often labeled as non-rational, traditionally referred to as gnosis in Western philosophical and religious traditions, and often understood in contraposition to science. These ways of knowing are becoming more and more influential in contemporary societies, popular culture, and academic research. What is the place of spirit possession, divination, and experiences perceived as out of the ordinary in our lives? How can we study and approach this type of phenomena? Going beyond dichotomies such as body and mind, ordinary and extraordinary, reason and experience, and matter and spirit, this series hosts scholars of different disciplines and practitioners interested in exploring and expanding the boundaries of what counts as knowledge today. So today I have the honor and pleasure to be here with Professor Heather Freeman. Heather is a professor of art and digital media in the Department of Art and Art History at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. She holds an MFA in Studio Art from Rutgers University and a BA in Fine Art and German Studies from Oberlin College. Additionally, and especially important for today's conversation, Professor Freeman is the host and writer of the podcast Magic in the United States, created in collaboration with PRX and funded by the grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Today, Heather and I will talk about the podcast Magic in the United States and about how this is both, and I'm quoting you, a love song to communities of magical practitioners, an effort to inspire greater religious curiosity and literacy in the US, and of your own interest, right, Heather, in the ever-evolving landscape of magical religious practice. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited, and I really appreciate getting to talk with you more.
Wonderful. I can't wait to have this conversation because I have to say, a little disclaimer, I'm assigning Heather's episodes on the podcast and to my students in my courses because they're so well done and so to the point that I find them an extraordinary also teaching device for my students. But let's start from your backstories. I'm always very curious about backstories. So how did you get interested in magic? Personally, maybe, professionally? How do you think about a podcast? A bit of backstory, if you can.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So it's funny in the podcast, we shorthand that as people's magical superhero origin stories. So it's like what's their superhero origin story? So this is mine. Like a lot of middle-class white Americans growing up in the Northeast, I was raised secular materialist, basically. I was raised, I would almost say a militant atheist, which makes some people a little anxious, but my understanding of militantism and atheism, I think that's probably actually a fair assessment. But at any rate, super bought into the myth of disenchantment. And I was going through life as an artist, primarily, and I don't think I really ever fully left a kind of magical worldview. Like a lot of kids, I was fascinated by witchcraft and fairies, and I had Erica Young's beautiful book, and that like really shaped a lot of my ideas about magic as a child. But being a teenager and a young adult and pursuing a career, all that falls by the wayside in a secular sort of materialist worldview. And also, I'm a digital artist. I still am to this day. So I was doing the tenure track gig. I had a kid. I was married. I still have all of those three things. And I was doing my digital art. And my mom died in 2010, and she was my best friend. It really rocked me. And I didn't really know it at the time, but I fell into this really kind of dark place. And there were just a few things that kind of gave me a lot of joy. One was alcohol, so that wasn't great. But the other was archery. And I got into archery when my mom got diagnosed with cancer, and I just kept doing it. I became the advisor of the club at UNC Charlotte, and I got to befriend some of the people there. And I did a Olympic style recurve. I mean, I still have my bows, I just don't do it much. So one day I'm at this archery event, and one of the women who's part of the club, who I just thought was hilarious, she was really, really smart, um, super takes no crap from anybody kind of person. And I knew she was doing religious studies as a master's student, but she was great. I thought she was just really the bee's knees. And she's working over lunch on something. And I was like, oh, what are you doing? And she's like, I'm working on a talk, kind of leave me alone. I'm busy. And I pestered her some more. And finally she said, well, I'm working on a talk that I got to give in like an hour, so please leave me alone. But I'm giving a talk on the horned god. And I was like, the what? And she said, the horned god of the Wicca. It's a thing. Leave me alone. Anyway, so I was like, what are you actually talking about? And she gave me a little bit more, that she identified as Wiccan, and that she was giving a talk at a local witch shop about this. And my brain exploded in that moment. I think I knew that Wicca existed, that it was a thing, but I honestly, like seriously, guys, I was so ignorant. I really thought it was like D&D or like LARPing or something. I
Okay.
didn't think that this was a real thing that people actually did. And the fact that this information was coming from this woman who I had so much respect for as a scholar, as a human being, there was a moment of disconnect for me that I really struggled with. So I immediately went to the witch shop where she was going to give her talk in a couple hours. I bought a shit ton of books. Sorry, I'm cussing. This is my New Jersey thing. But I bought a crap ton of books, and I just started reading, and I just fell in love with the fact that there was this way of living with an enchanted worldview. And I sort of shed off that myth of disenchantment it took a couple of years. But I found myself completely enamored with the plurality and diversity of magical practices that exist globally. The fact that these practices have always coexisted with things that we today regard as science, and that these really are part of the intangible cultural heritage that is part of humanity. So when I talk about human creativity, I think about art and dance and music and literature and poetry and magic and religion. And like those are things that I hold very, very dear now. So anyway, part of that, at some point I did, of course, start practicing magic. How can you not at a certain point, or at least experiment a little bit? And I would say that like I function now. I don't like the word animism. I wish we had a better word, only because the history of it is so fraught, and every time you use that word, you have to define it, which makes it not very useful as a word. So until we get a better word for it, this sort of more contemporary view of it as living in a very, very enchanted world. And if I were a chaos magician, which I have a soft spot for a lot of different magical practices, but I would say I work under a spirit model of magic. And as I said, I'm still an artist, a digital artist. Actually, what I can do if
Yes.
yeah, I want to do this. All right, let me see
Yes.
if I can.
And in the meantime, I said that I normally refer to neo-animism as relational ontologies, because I
I
also
like that.
do not like the history of the term, and I find myself situating within that space, and
Yeah.
that's how I call it.
I like that,
Um,
relational ontologies. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think it's one of the things that we'll talk about this later with the podcast, but trying to reshape academic language for generalist audiences.
yes.
When you have to assume uh, a high school education, but maybe potentially not much more than that, it shifts how you approach language. But yeah, like this was some of the art that I was doing before I discovered magic, and which
Mhm.
like I've always functioned as an artist in a magical space. I just didn't call it that. And then this is a new project I'm working on now. I still work with digital tech. I'm treating an instance of stable diffusion as an oracular spirit, which is, I have ethical challenges with AI just like everybody else. I'm actually giving a talk on that next week or next month. But actually, here we go. But these are some of the outputs, and it spits something out, but then I rework it really heavily. So you actually can't really see the original imagery under all the painting and drawing I do. Like what the AI spits out is super, super different than all this. But it's a collaboration with the AI. And then this was a collaboration I did with Trey Henry, who's an occultist and a software engineer. It's really his idea. I did the art for it, but it's a natively digital divination system, and it's free, so you can download it and play with it. But basically, it has these cards that are cut in half, and it shuffles it, and then you look for matches. And actually reading it as a divination system is really complex, but I got to do the drawings for it, which was a real honor and a real joy. So anyway, like you can go to my website. There's all kinds of goofy stuff there, but
Yes,
yeah.
fantastic. So let's share your website in the chat if it's not already there, and we'll definitely do so. That's very interesting. Thank you for giving us all the details about your backstory, and in very many ways, it's similar to mine. I also, my, let's say, discovery of magic in my life had to go through the passing of my mom.
Oh yeah.
And it was the activator of a number of different ways to engage with questions that could not be answered in other ways.
Yeah.
Similar to you, curiosity that lands, right? Because there's a earth that is fertile for, this landing and this enchanted world. I think it delivers lots of new perspectives that I also use it for my creativity. My creativity is writing, is not art, but I can definitely see a connection, and I really like the way you frame magic as one of intangible heritage. So wonderful. So I didn't know that, so I discovered today with all of you. Wonderful. So is this the reason why you decided to do a podcast, and why a podcast, and why magic? Yeah. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that story?
Yeah, so like a lot of academics, so I discovered magic. I've always had it in my life, but I really fell hard into it at the age of 40. So I had just gotten, or actually, I was just getting promotion to full professor, and it really took me a while. This was like really rough on my family, honestly, because they were like, "What is happening to mom?" And so it this transition into feeling comfortable approaching the topic of magic in my professional life took a little while, because that stigma against magic in academia is really real. It's part of that myth of disenchantment. And it's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this podcast series, actually, is because not just for secular audience or lay audiences, but for academics too. We have our own biases. We're human beings, just like anybody else. But so my first sort of tiptoe into that was in 2016. I was reading a lot about the early modern witch trials. I was obsessed. And I was obsessed with the concept of the familiar in the early modern witch trials in England and also the Basque Country. And in 2016, we were also getting ready for an election. There was a lot of concern about disinformation online, particularly from bots, which is something, it seems so quaint to talk about bots today. It's like dial-up phones, but bots was the hot thing at that time. And I started to see this beautiful poetic parallel between the way a malicious familiar and a malicious bot sort of sneak into your safe spaces and wreak havoc in your sense of reality, or actually in both cases, cause physical harm potentially. And so I decided to draft this idea of looking at the history of information technologies, the early modern printing press and social media, and looking at how societies adapted to disinformation and misinformation, and how these new technologies also shaped and disseminated information, which was very, very similar. So I wrote some grants, and I'd been doing short films for a long time. So this was going to be my first feature film. And it was great. Like, I got to interview Ronald Hutton and Owen Davies and Dan Harms, Al Cummins, Marion Gibson, who I want to like steal away onto a boat and just like she doesn't know this. I'm just like telling everybody else about this. I love Marion Gibson so much. She's so cool. But at any rate, I got to do these interviews with people who were just heroes of mine. And I was editing this. It was great. I had students working on animation, so it was going to be a combination of live action and animation. And then the 2020 pandemic hit. My funding got frozen. And like everybody else, I was sitting on this massive multi-year long project that looked like it was just going to, die. So I decided during lockdown, I was just going to pivot. I needed to get it done before the 2020 elections. A lot of the data in that, or a lot of the interviews were already getting a little dated with the bots and technology. So I needed to get it out really soon. So I pivoted and made a podcast series. And it's not well edited as a podcast series. Like the sound design is great and all that, but the sequencing of how you tell a story over audio is really, really different than film. And I just hadn't really grasped that. So I finished this series. It's fine. I did finish a 20-minute movie eventually, which you can also see on my website. But I was bit by the bug of podcasting. I loved that format. I loved the medium. I loved the storytelling part of it. And so about a year after I finished that project, I started working on a grant to do another podcast series. And I really was thinking then about how troubling I found religious illiteracy in the United States. And as a magical practitioner, that was impacting me directly, right? And so I was really thinking a lot about this tension between when is something a religion and when is something magic, and who gets to decide that, and who are they deciding it for? And I realized these were big questions that because we don't talk about sex, politics, or religion. A lot of these big questions about magic we don't really talk about, including among magical practitioners at times. So I talked to Sean McLeod, who teaches religious studies at UNC Charlotte, and a couple other folks whose judgment I really valued. And we started pulling together a team of humanities advisors to sort of help me do the research that I couldn't do for all of the span of American history and magical, spiritual, and folk practices. And we put together a NEH grant. We got rejected. The NEH was great. I asked for feedback. They gave really, really great detailed feedback. And they basically said, girl, look, you're like this art professor. You're not a media production company. Like if you partner up with like an NPR or something, like try this again. And so I felt a little discouraged by that because I really didn't know anybody in media corporations. And so the grant deadline was coming back around in August. I was sitting at home feeling depressed. So I said, screw it. I'll get on LinkedIn. I'll just start cold emailing whoever. So I found some email addresses for PRX. I cold emailed some people and they got back to me. And I was floored because I was fangirling because they do The Moth and This American Life. And I fangirl them. I still to this day, I fangirl them really hard. And so I had a meeting with them, and like the whole time I'm trying to be like really cool and professional, but I'm just like inside, I'm screaming like a teenage girl. And they finally say, yeah, if you get this NEH grant, which will cover our bills, we'll do this. And I said, okay. So I reapplied with PRX on the grant and we got it. So we're funded for 3 seasons. Season 1 is complete. It's out. There's 6 episodes in each season, and season 2 is coming out May 7th is when the first episode launches. Yeah.
Wonderful. So some highlights of season 1. Do you want to tell us from the
Oh, yeah.
Someone you met, what's your favorite episode? I don't know.
Oh my gosh.
Some of your opinion.
There's so much. And I learned, I have to say, like, shout out to the PRX team. I have learned so much about journalism and podcasting that I, as like an artist, like just didn't know. But yeah, Reverend Aaron Davis is like probably one of my favorite people on the planet. I think he's so amazing as just a human being, and his story, he was so generous with his story. And when I talked to him, he had actually just experienced a pretty significant personal loss, and He was just like, let's just go ahead and do the interview anyway. And he's just such a bright light, right? Like, I know I feel like that's a really cheesy phrase, but I really do feel that way about him. Um, and also I fangirl him. But yeah, one of the funny things about that first season though is we had so many weird tech problems, and everybody on the team was working on other shows too, and they weren't experiencing these technical problems on other shows. And I started, because I'm a magical practitioner and I think about woo things, I started wondering like, oh my gosh, like I feel like there's spirit interference in this, and like I'm not sure. So I did divinations, and the divinations came back like, yeah, there's spirit influence, but like don't worry about it. And at one point, I have a devotional practice to Hecate, so there's a lot of devotional relationships with spirits of the dead and chthonic spirits, and um, at one point I was researching for the last episode, which features interviews with Jaewon Koo and Jennifer Kim, and it's looking at the different ways in which Korean shamanistic practices have sort of percolated into the lives of contemporary Korean American practitioners. And just two people in this one example. And I was researching for this, and there was a video of Jennifer Kim basically with these bells calling the spirits. And so she's like, I'm watching this YouTube video in my kitchen. She's like calling the spirits. And my family, we foster dogs for like, that's just the thing. We've had like 20 foster dogs over the last couple of years. And I had a foster dog at that point in time, and dog is sleeping. These bells are ringing. And then all of a sudden, the dog, who nothing in the house disturbs this dog. This dog gets up, runs over to the fireplace, and starts barking at the fireplace, this incredibly liminal space. And I start getting these chills like, oh, digital technologies are useful for invoking the dead. Good. Check. Got that going. But there were times when it felt like the ancestors of a lot of these practitioners were sort of crowding the video line, honestly. And it was actually weirdly affirming as a practitioner, because there was this sense of there are these stories that need to be told, they need to be heard, and this is an avenue to do that. So, but it also sort of heightened my sense of responsibility to the practitioners. Every single episode that we do, my first responsibility is to the practitioners who are so generous and vulnerable in sharing their stories. I have to honor that first. And then next comes the scholars who are talking about these practices, and then the audience comes after that. So, that first season, I really learned that hierarchy of values for myself, which I hadn't really thought about going into it.
I'm so happy you're saying this, because it reminds me a lot about how I engage with ethnography. Definitely, my interlocutors are my main reference point when I write. Then, pagan studies, and then, academia as the third step of the or wider public. But really, I do feel that the simple fact that people are sharing their lives and stories in such a vulnerable way, it needs to be my ethical, light beacon. So I'm very happy you said this, and spent explicitly studied this, because I think it shows from the podcast, from your episodes. But I'm so happy that you spelled it out. So you mentioned that part of what you wanted to do this was to educate the public. Did you have any response from your audience? What happened? They contacted you. Did you have feedback? Do you have something to share?
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I think I had in my mind that the audience would all be people like my in-laws, who I'm really, really close to, but they're all Catholics, and they I'm sure they must know by now that I'm a practitioner. Like, I talk about it, but I don't know. Maybe they don't know. But I was thinking about people like that in my life who don't really know that people do this for real. But most of the response has actually been from pagans and magical practitioners, which has been really interesting. And a lot of them have said, "Oh, thank God, this is something I can like give to my family or give to my coworkers so they can know what I do." So in that sense, it's not the direct line to that audience I was sort of hoping for, but that was hugely affirming. I think there's been criticisms too, and it's one of these things where going into this, I was most worried about either secular atheists or the religious right maybe being concerned about the content, especially with federal funding. But actually, I think most of the negative responses come from practitioners. And there's not been a lot. There's been like honest, it's 2 emails, so I can like leave it at that. But those that negative feedback you take really seriously. And there have been a number of episodes where we were addressing a topic that was not without controversy, right? And we had to make a judgment call. And it's still to this day, it's one of these things where I'm like, I bet in like 5 years when I know more, I'm going to sort of regret like how I framed this particular thing. But shamanic practices in particular, like there's a lot of folks who for whom shamanism is a really, really important part of their practice. And I do respect that and I value that. But there's also a really complex history there that if you're going to use that word, I feel like you need to be so educated about it, like just to do justice. But I also have to acknowledge not everybody's interested in that. And that's not my place to make a judgment call either. So.
Aren't we all, in 5 years regretting some of how we framed some aspect of how we frame things? I mean, it's part of being in process of, trying to do the best with the things you have in that moment in life. And how do you deal with negative criticism? Just 2 emails, but how did you feel about it? How do you, handle it?
Oh,
being
yeah.
so public?
Yeah. No, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I'm really glad I come from an art and design background. So I've worked in both graphic design as an applied artist, but also fine art. And in visual arts, one of the first things you learn is you put your heart and soul into something, and then you put it in front of your peers for critique, and you check your ego at the door. And then you take that input and you sleep on it for a night. And then the next morning you sort of decide what's really useful in this. What can I take? What am I in a place where I'm prepared to take something from that and use that to improve the work? With podcasts, unfortunately, like once it's out in the world, it's not like I can go back and re-edit it. I can make new content with, better informed. Sometimes the feedback was really like responding to cultural moments that are impossible, and that's and it's just sort of I grieve, but I feel okay about like how I handled things in a particular episode. And other times, like I've spent a lot of time talking to other scholars who aren't advisors on the podcast or other practitioners, and ask them like, did I do this right? Like, what are the things that I might have missed? And most of the time, almost all the time, it comes back, what, this is complex. And there's not, we like to have good and evil. We want a right and a wrong. And sometimes there's a world of gray and you just have to live with that. So.
Yes, that's a wonderful teaching. And I hope my students and all of us, it's a good reminder. I think academia is a space in which we all, are read and criticized. And I think it's a safe space for that, putting ego aside, I mean, in certain cases, let's say. But you were mentioning, maybe aspects of parts of society that are less aligned with, healthy criticism, right? So it's also a very vulnerable space to inhabit, that of being, able to educate and to speak a language that is understandable by many. As you were saying, high school sort of graduates level, which I think it's a virtue, by the way. I don't think it's, being able to do that. I think it's hard. It requires lots of skills and lots of clarity in where you stand and what you know and how to tell it. So it's it's way more difficult than I think writing for, in the lingo, academic
Oh,
lingo.
yeah.
On the one hand, doing this, and I think there's an ethical, drive to engage with that. On the other hand, it's so vulnerable to a number of, on the internet, especially a number of voices that, are not always playing the fair game, right?
Right.
So it's a complicated space. I commend you for, being courageous and brave to be able to have it. But maybe we should all do more, right? As academics, we should all try to be able to do that.
Yeah, I mean it's true, but I think too it's like I do feel like if you go into a conversation, whether it's online or on a podcast or in a paper, if you go into that from a place of an open heart and an open mind, um, that vulnerability is a little bit contagious, or can be. So I haven't gotten like any kind of like weird hate messages or anything on it, social media or anything like that. But I think that's because probably most audiences can tell I am trying really hard to do this from a place of love, and I think like there's a lot. I think that the stuff online that people get really irritated about is when folks are trying to dictate something from a place of authority, and that's a little different. So
that's very true. That's very true. And thank you again for sharing this,
yeah.
wisdom. No, really, I think it's a very valuable in the content and also in the form that you use in order to express it. What are the main takeaways of this season 1 before moving to season 2? What do you think are the main takeaways?
I think the big thing is really framing this idea of bricolage of cultural remixing for audiences and really setting the groundwork for that for audiences, especially in that first episode, and also thinking about the difference between a practice and a belief, and that they aren't always the same things, and that people can maintain multiple beliefs and multiple practices that others might think should be contradictory. And so I think that the whole first season is trying to lay out that idea a little bit so that in season 2 we can complicate that a little bit more.
Wonderful. And what about season 2?
Yeah, so I have a trailer. Should we listen to the trailer first? Okay, all right.
Yes.
Sweet. Flowers. The first ripe berries. Music in the air. They're all symbols of springtime, love, and friendship. And they're also found on sacred altars and shrines across the U.S., where they're dedicated to gods, spirits, ancestors, even to the land itself. Somewhere, flowers adorn a newly cleaned ancestor shrine. Berries and cream are offered in friendship to a spirit. A love note to a tree hangs on tissue paper from a branch. But what should we make of these offerings? Are they magical practices, religious traditions, or are they something else entirely? I'm Heather Freeman. In season 1 of Magic in the United States, we met some of the many witches, magicians, and spiritual seekers who shaped this country's magical landscape. And now we're back with season 2. We'll time travel to a Wiccan tradition created by and for gay men in the 1970s, and to the origins of the social media tag manifesting in the 1800s. We'll learn how a Supreme Court case brought an African diaspora tradition to national attention, and how a Paiute dance became a profound religious movement. We'll reveal the history of Appalachian magical practices and unpack the religious controversies over Satanism.
This was a gay man who was being true to himself, who was really saying, no, my magic is valid, and I'm not going to be discounted here.
The Supreme Court said you can't pass a law to specifically target a leukemia community.
Magic and stuff aside, she's just a mom with witchcraft. You get in trouble and your mom grounds you. I get in trouble, a candle is lit and I'm grounded.
thinking about how we might return the land to the people from whom it was dispossessed.
You can basically self-hypnotize by just reciting these affirmations and convince yourself that you're capable of amazing things.
Join me on May 7th for more magic, religion, and spiritual remixing in Season 2 of Magic in the United States, wherever you get your podcasts. I'll see you at the crossroads.
With Hecate.
I know.
Wonderful, lots of juicy stuff. What did you think you're accomplishing with the number 2 season rather than the number 1? What do you think you are doing here?
Well, the first thing is I'm finally tackling witchcraft. I had so many people who are like, "When are you going to talk about witchcraft?" And I'm like, "I'll get there. I'll get there." And part of the challenge with witchcraft is that it is such a vastly huge plural concept, and it's so contextual, and it's like there is no way to talk about any particular aspect of it without shining a big spotlight on all the aspects that you're not talking about. So I was just like, okay, fine, I'll just do this. And I had a copy of Michael Lloyd's Bull of Heaven. And I was like, you know what, like the Bull of Heaven, Eddie Basinski's story tells so much about so many things in just his sort of life story, that we decided to just go ahead and use that to kind of look at a couple different angles at witchcraft. It's still super narrow, but hopefully based on that, then in Season 3 I can try tackling witchcraft from a very different angle. Yeah, in this one, we decided to tackle a couple of the topics that were a little bit more tricky in the sense that they really aren't magical practices. They really are religions. Flip side is that there are definitely people who are practitioners of these religions who also practice magic. And they use a language where they can go back and forth between it really easily. But especially in the case of Lukumi and also Native American spiritualities, right? Which is like such a rich, complex thing because it's not like it's a singular thing. And most audiences don't know that, right? So with that particular episode, the big challenge there is most American audiences know so little that it was like, how do we tuck into this particular question of magic being used as a pejorative to describe Native American ceremony when there's like so much there that audiences really need to know. Yeah, so I mean, these are episodes that we're taking a stab at, but like I feel like Season 1 we handled things that were a little bit safer. I think if we start getting angry emails, it'll be this one, and it'll be justified because it's like we took on harder topics. So
no, I understand. I also teach magic, courses on magic, and what is in the syllabus and what is outside the syllabus is always, and I have to explain always why I did not put Lukumi in my syllabus, why I did not put Native American religion in my syllabus, because magic has been used for centuries as a derogatory term with ethical connotations, right? And all that was not world religions was lumped into this cauldron of craziness, moral, morally doubtful sort of, cauldron of things. And so Lukumi is Lukumi. Then again, there are some who claim, what it is magic, or claim also magic. And then we can study them, but without, branching out from a place that knows the space and place of the word magic and the history of our thoughts. Sorry if I do this, but maybe not all of our, among our audience has had the chance to think thoroughly about this. So it's, I really appreciate that. And I think it's very necessary actually to, step up the game and say, okay, now that we are confident that we can, address magic and have an idea of complicated with lots of gray areas about what magic is and is not, let's look at the, how even more complicated There's a situation sometimes.
Yeah.
So that's fantastic. I'm so happy and can't wait to listen to your episode, your season 2. I
Thanks.
normally listen to your podcast as many at the gym. So
I do it when I'm lifting weights. Yeah, for sure.
So can you tell us about your working process? So you mentioned briefly, do you have advisors or someone who helps you out, maybe retracing some of the literature? So how does it work? How does it work, the creation of one episode?
Yeah, so we when we wrote the NEH grant, we actually had summaries of all 3 seasons, all 18 episodes, and then almost immediately we had to start revising that. But basically, I'll draft summaries of what those episodes will basically be about, and I run them by the Humanities advisors, and they give me notes and thoughts. And part of that is because I can read a lot pretty quickly, but I can't read like 10 books per episode. So I really lean very heavily on those humanities advisors to help me make sure that I'm not missing really important things in the scholarship. And in some cases, that's actually made me sort of decide not to do certain episodes because there's too much controversy in academia about certain things, and I need to let that settle a little bit so that I can figure out how to reflect it accurately to an audience without getting into the weeds about academic debates. That's a whole nother thing. But once we do that, then in some cases I'll build an outline. Other cases I won't. So the Eddie Basinski story, that outline really is like, it's just the cold version of Michael Lloyd's book. So I really didn't need to build an outline. His whole life is right there. But once I build that outline, I'll develop interview questions for scholars as well as practitioners. And while all that's happening simultaneously, I start reaching out to people, cold emailing people to do quick sort of preliminary interviews. So they're 15 or 20-minute long phone calls. If we really hit it off, it ends up being like an hour. But just sort of seeing how people talk about the particular topic to try to figure out who's going to be a good expert for that episode, but also to make sure that there's points that I'm not missing and the scholars aren't missing. Which there's always going to be more things, but and then we run the interviews. So when we have an interview, we use a software called Riverside, and it actually records the audio locally and then uploads it, which is great. But the whole a big chunk of the PRX team is there, as well as the interview subject. And then once we're done with the interviews for a particular episode, I'll listen to them all again and start building an edit. So I go really, really long, and then I cull it down gradually. Lucy Perkins is an amazing editor, and I basically give her my hot mess. And then she would tell me, it's not a hot mess you're giving me, Heather. But I'm like, Lucy, it is a hot mess. We know. But then she sort of, with a fresh set of eyes, moves things around and asks questions and points out areas where there's a jump in logic. And one of the things that's been great about working with PRX is that the folks on my team, as far as I know, none of them are practitioners. So all of this is like new information for them. And so they're also really kind of the target audience too. So sometimes I'll just assume people know something, and then they'll point out to me like, no, Heather, like, we don't know what you're talking about. And then once we have a good edit and mix, and we do a recording of my narration, Jenny Cataldo does the sound design and mix, and then we usually have 1 or 2 drafts, or usually 2 drafts of that. And then once it goes through all the approval, it goes live. So it takes about 6 months to make 6 episodes, but we're working on all 6 episodes all at the same time. So. And then I do the graphics and make the art for the episodes, which I wish I had a student intern to do that, but that hasn't worked out yet. So basically, I'm once those episodes are sort of wrapped up, then I start doing the marketing push for them along with our marketing team.
lots of work, and thank you for guiding us through this rigorous, ethically sound, collaborative, and heart-centered process. I have to say, it's lots of work, and it shows, actually.
Oh.
I think it shows. So we have some questions from the audience.
Oh,
so
yeah.
let me see. So Anonymous asks, what's your opinion on how ancient accounts of visible appearance, contact, conversation with spirits happen? Something that would appear in the operator's imagination with the aid of pharmakeia, or something else entirely? So do you have any opinion? And also Joe asked that, thank you very much for sharing your experience and insights today. When interacted with non-human ontologies, for example, spirits, how do you protect yourself? How do you know whether a particular spirit is trustworthy or perhaps poses danger? It seems that any action which entails inviting a non-human being, even something as harmless as watching a YouTube video, is an act of releasing some amount of control. Do such interactions ever feel become dangerous? I think we can group these two questions, talking about, yes, how do you handle spirits, right?
No, I love it. Yeah, no, these are great questions. In terms of ancient, if I remember the first one correctly, ancient experiences, that's such a good, rich question, because I think we're relying on textual records, occasionally material objects, and trying to infer things from it. I'm okay. I just completed menopause like 2 weeks ago, and so the menopause brain thing is real. Who's the author who wrote the book about Sumerian ghosts? The historian. Do you know who I'm talking about?
I don't remember. I've always been in that brain fog thing.
I know. Okay. It's great.
Yes.
Best excuse ever. I protect myself from spirits with my brain fog. No, I don't do that. But anyway, he wrote this really beautiful book about like conceptions of spirits, and especially restless dead, and how communities and individuals and families like navigated that as like a very real part of their lived reality. So yeah, I think I do fantasize about another podcast series looking at like, what do we actually know about ancient magic, and like how are we deducing these things, because it's such a fascinating field right now. So that's one part of things. In terms of like my own practice, especially with digital technologies, yeah, I think there's a couple ways of looking at it, and I think this gets into a lot of how do you think spirits are, like what do you think the quality of spirits are, and different folks, Stephen Skinner, other folks have very strong opinions about that, and I think that's something that's it's always going to be a little impossible to tell, right? Like we live in meat sacks in the physical world. This is our realm of experience, and we can kind of push into the invisible and dip our toes in it a little bit, but we can't fully embody that experience, at least as long as we're alive, as far as we know. There's tethered ways of doing it, but by and large, and I think there's some people who are exceptionally called to that, indigenous Korean shaman being a really good example. But that's a different sort of plateau of things. I don't think spirits are like people. They're not, right? Like it's not, and this gets into things about AI, but they're different than us, just like animals are not people. But like if my foster dog is scared or happy or hungry, we've been around each other enough that I know their body language to be able to attend to their needs better. And they know my body language, and they know how to communicate with me, but we're not the same. And I think some spirits are more, they communicate with us more easily than others. I can't remember who it was who said this, but somebody was talking about working with spirits as being like animal training, that you have to like train and subdue and sort of break a spirit in order to interact with it like an animal. And I remember reading that, and as somebody who works with animals, both domestic and wild animals, I'm actually a licensed falconer. It's not like, that's not how we work with animals though. And I think that's true with spirits. Like when I work with a wild hawk, they are not social animals. They don't respond to negative reinforcements. That's just not how their brains are wired. They respond to only a few positive reinforcements. And most of when you're building trust is just, it's never really trust. You're just proving to them time and again through repetition that you're not going to hurt them. And eventually they also come to realize that you're a source of food, and you build this sort of collaborative relationship, but it's not a bond of friendship. It never is. They're just not wired like that. Humans are incredibly social. That is how we're wired. And at the same time with that hawk, even though I can feel confident that when I'm working with it, I'm relatively safe because I know the degree of training of that hawk and I know its behavior and how to read its body language. It's still a wild animal. It's always going to be dangerous. Like I could still lose an eye. And so there's always this caution built out of respect for difference. And I think also coming at it from a place of love rather than a place of control. I understand that the hawk doesn't grok love. That's fine. But when I interact with it and treat it that way, that is how I'm programmed. I do operate from a place of love. And so I try to shift that in a way that can facilitate that relationship. And I think it's sort of similar with spirits, right? Like spirits are not a singular form as far as I can tell. I think there's a real plurality of what they are. A land spirit's not the same as a saint, which is not the same as a god. I mean, I think all of those designations are just verbal categories that we're coming up with to try to describe things that are really like just hard to define a shape with language because they aren't material. So this is like my current hot take. Ask me in 5 minutes, it's gonna change. But I think, you know, a lot of people have talked about that metaphor about like, you know, getting into a car and driving a car is dangerous, you know, and the same is true with doing anything magically. But depending on where you live in the US, if you don't have access to a car, you ain't going nowhere. And the same is true with spirits. I think it is a rich, complex, beautiful world, and that world is dangerous. But, you know, you have one life. Even if you believe in reincarnation, you got this one. And it's worth engaging with it and engaging with others, including spirit others, I think. So.
Thank you, Heather. First of all, I want to mention Matt came to the rescue and wrote Irving Finkel.
Thank you. Yes. Oh my
Matt.
gosh. Thank you. Yes.
And also I want to mention, just throwing the ethnographer anthropologist take on this, that you know, anthropologists showed that it's not that there's one word and different ways to describe it. Possibly we have to entertain the possibility that there are different words happening at the same time. And so in some world, these non-human beings might be afford the possibility of harm, and other less so in different ways. It really depends on, you know, the ontologies you inhabit.
Yeah.
In some ways. So
absolutely.
But I think it's a very fascinating question and a very fascinating answer. Thank you so much for engaging with this. We have other questions. Oh, thank you for the compliments. If we think that magic is metaphysic, do you think that all religion are magic?
Oh yeah, that's a fun one. Yeah, no, because like the classic, so we're deliberately using the word magic as a hook for this whole podcast series, right? Like it is its own glamour magic, to be clear. Yeah, there's that question, like, is prayer spellcasting? Like, and I think a lot of it will hinge on a personal level, like is the word magic a pejorative to you? Right? If to you personally, the word magic is something that's gross and you wouldn't want to engage with it, and it's not something, it's wrong and evil and whatever, then no, that like prayer is not magic. If you're a magical practitioner and you're casting a spell, is that spell prayer? Depends on your relationship back to the idea of prayer. You know, if you have religious trauma, you know, you might really lean against that word prayer. So I think the language is very subjective. What it's doing metaphysically, which was actually the question. Uh, yeah, my personal experience, because I do pray and I do cast spells, my personal experience is that they're functioning in very, very similar lines. But I think like what they're doing differently and how they're engaging differently has more to do with the purpose of that individual's prayer and that individual spell. For me personally, spell work is working towards a particular end goal and change. Prayer is building a relationship and nurturing a relationship with the spirit. But that's just me. I wouldn't really say that that's a good universal definition necessarily.
And I would chime in with my ethnographic anthropological perspective. I'm teaching courses on magic and I research magic. I'm more and more inclined to think about magic in epistemological terms as a way of knowing that is not rational, that is participatory, that engages the body, that engages intuition, other faculties that we don't necessarily engage with in our, rational engagement with the world. And therefore, even not everybody, and I think that distinction, if you think magic is a bad word for you, don't use it, but some use it, right? But regardless, you can find the expressions of this participatory consciousness, as Susan Greenwood defines it, that are in every spiritual, religious, but also, just by being in nature or listening to music, right? You can access that type of knowing. So what helped me as a scholar frame the conundrum of magic, religion, and so on is, giving it an epistemological twist. And I think it's a fair, thing to do, at least in the history of anthropology. This has been done, plenty by plenty. But so this is my, 2 cents.
Oh, no, I
thank you
love
for the
that.
question.
I think your the epistemological take also gets at this question of, in both the spell casting and prayer, is this a solitary action or is this a community-based action? Because that changes things again too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Even more reasons to listen to your podcast and to study magic and to join Gnoseologies. I think it's time to wrap up, sadly, because I would have continued this conversation for a long time, but we might, who knows in the future. So thank you, Professor Freeman, for your participation and wonderful conversation. And thank you all really for having been with us, for asking questions. Please stay tuned on the activities of the CSWR, the Transcendence and Transformation Initiative, and of Gnoseologies. This is our last event for the semester and for the year, but I hope to see you in the next year. So you can find all the information about the activities on the CSWR website or in the chat. So thank you for being with us and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks everyone for coming.
Sponsor, Center for the Study of World Religions.
Copyright 2024, the President and Fellows of Harvard College.